party nights, the law was on her side. But who can stand when she's in the middle? Her schemes and plans. Cause we danced on the floor and around. So take my strong advice. Just remember to always think twice. She told my baby we danced to three. Then she looked at me. Then showed a photo. My baby cried. His eyes looked like mine. Go on, dance on the floor and around. People always told me, be careful what you do, and don't go around breaking young girls' hearts. She came just to right by me, then the smell of sweet perfume. This happened much too soon. She called me to her room. Billie Jean's not my lover. She's just a girl who claims that I am the one. But the kid is not my son. Billie Jean's not my lover. She's just a girl who claims that I am the one. But the kid is not my son. She says I am the one, but the kid is not my son. She says I am the one, but the kid is not my son.
Hola, 1, 2, 3. Ey, ey, ey. Hola, 1, 2, 3.
Billie Jean's not my lover. She's just a girl who claims that I am the one, but the kid is not my son. She says I am the one, but the kid is not my son. She says I am the one. She says he is my son. book on the shelf is always repeating itself. Waterloo, I was defeated, you won the war. Waterloo, promised to love you forevermore. Waterloo, couldn't escape if I wanted to. Waterloo, knowing my fate is to be with you. Waterloo, finally facing my Waterloo. My, I tried to hold you back, but you were stronger. Oh yeah, and now it seems my only chance is giving up the fight. And how could I ever refuse? I feel like I win when I lose. Oh, Waterloo, I was defeated, you won the war. Waterloo, promised to love you forevermore. Waterloo, couldn't escape if I wanted to. Waterloo, knowing my fate is to be with you. Waterloo, finally facing my Waterloo. And how could I ever refuse? I feel like I win when I lose. Waterloo, I was defeated, you won the war. Waterloo, promised to love you forevermore. Waterloo, couldn't escape if I wanted to. Waterloo, knowing my fate is to be with you. Waterloo, finally facing my Waterloo. Waterloo, finally facing my Waterloo. Waterloo, finally facing my If I should stay, I would only be in your way. So I'll go, but I know I'll think of you every step of the way. And I will always love you. I will always love you. Bittersweet memories, that is all I'm taking with me. So goodbye, don't cry. We both know I'm not what you
Please, if everyone can start taking their seats, so we can start in 1-2 minutes. Sí, no, ya estamos. Me dijeron que empezaba a las 10, o sea, por eso. Okay, hello. Good morning, everyone. So let's try to get everyone in so we can start this session. Okay, hello everyone. I hope you are full of energy still for this last day. So let's start this final keynote speaker lectures and things. So first of all, it's really an honor to me to introduce our first woman keynote speaker. Oh, well, but I mean, it's empirical thing, this. She's the first one today. So I'm going to present Susie Kerr. Many of you are here in Bogota would be familiar with her because she held a position as a visiting professor at Universidad de los Andes. And she's now the chief economist in the Environmental Defense Fund. Susie graduated from Harvard University, and she is the founder of Motu Economic and Public Policy Research in New Zealand. Her work and leadership in topics of RED and ETS, especially in Latin America, is really impressive, with a really interesting publication as well in different topics. She has worked closely with government, donors, and private sector CEOs seeking market-based solutions to environmental challenges. So please join me to welcome Susie Kerr.
Gracias y buenos días a todos. Kia ora tātou, ko Susie Kerr au, ko Otaki taku awa, ko maunga whā taku maunga. In New Zealand, as Sean knows, it is traditional to begin a talk by introducing yourself in Māori and saying a little bit about where you're from, and this is where I'm from. And you might notice, if you are Colombian, that I'm a tiny little bit from Colombia, and if you're Chilean, I'm a tiny bit from Chile as well. But I'm also now a little from New York. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the Environmental Defence Fund and how that might be able to work more closely with Environment for Development. So I think Environment for Development is an amazing network of people, and I've had the privilege to be a little bit involved for a number of years now. Environmental Defence Fund is also an outstanding organisation. It is a non-profit and it focuses on economics-based advocacy. So it's unusual in the NGO space in that we have more than 30 environmental economists, and we really do focus on doing effective advocacy. We, over the last 15 years, have been expanding out beyond the United States and now have offices and a presence in many developing countries as well. And we're interested in how we can be more effective in working with those countries. The two organizations share very similar goals. We both want to have people have very high levels of well-being and live in a world where it is sustainable. But we have very different approaches, and these could be highly complementary. Your network is more research-focused and very locally focused, and EDF is really very much focused on policy and government. So I don't have a special issue to announce, but I do have some jobs, and at least one of you has already applied for this, which is fantastic. So please, if you know really great students, we're looking. And I've also been talking with a few of you about an idea that we are evolving. I call it here Econ Action, but it's a terrible name, so if someone has a better name, please help. The idea is to create a program where good economists can have some experience working in really good policy environments where economists are effective to learn better what it takes to be effective using economics in policy and create a network of people who have this sort of experience. So now turning to the topic of the day. So this is something I've been working on actually since my PhD, so it's a long-term project, but much more intensively in the last few years with colleagues all over the world in very many different countries. We're essentially looking for a solution to what I see as a major problem in the current Paris implementation of the current Paris Agreement. So the focus is on large-scale involvement and on what we call minilateral agreements. So as opposed to bilateral, which involve two, or multilateral, which is the UN framework, looking at small groups of countries cooperating, because we know from behavioral economics and from game theory that it's easier to get cooperation among smaller groups of people, even though global climate change does require ultimately multilateral cooperation as well. So just starting with the challenge, if we're going to get climate stability, we actually have to get emissions not just down, but to zero. They have to go to net zero. That means that any emissions that remain are offset by some sort of sequestration somewhere. And for countries like New Zealand, my country, or like the United States, we would hope, or countries in Europe, that has to happen fast because we have the ability to make it happen fast. Many countries already have goals to get to net zero by 2050. But other countries might not go quite as fast as that. Chile also has a goal of net zero by 2050, or they call it carbon neutrality by 2050, but they might go a little slower in the meantime. It might take them a slightly slower path to get there. China maybe will be slower again. Again, it has to get to the same endpoint, but they're not quite peaked yet in terms of their emissions, and that pathway may take a little longer. The faster we can go, the better, but inevitably some countries will take longer. And maybe a country like Kenya will take longer still. There may be a period where, with economic growth and with a growing population and the difficulties of transforming rapidly, there may be a period where emissions still continue to grow in Kenya. And I'm sorry if there's anyone Kenyan here, I'm just using that as one example. But ultimately, emissions have to get to zero in Kenya too. Because the climate doesn't stop warming until we stop the emissions. So this is a really huge challenge. And we need to work out how we're going to get there. This is a transformational challenge. We ultimately have to go from where we are to somewhere very, very different. And there are many ways we could do that, and there are very many different future worlds, all of which would have zero emissions. So over on the left here, this might be a world that is zero emissions but is really unpleasant. People are unhappy, maybe there's been a lot of war, etc. This is this is all those teenage fiction books of dystopia. Not very nice. Over here, there are a lot of different ways we could have a wonderful future that is also low emissions. And we don't need to know now exactly where we're going to, but we're up here and we may need to make choices in the short term. So in my sort of former life, pre-children, I used to be a whitewater kayaker. So I think of myself in a kayak up here. I don't have this view from above. I don't know what the whole pattern is, but I'm having to make decisions about which route I take all the way along and trying to make decisions that are going to head me in the right direction and that are ultimately going to allow that transformational change. So how are we doing so far in terms of making these short-run decisions? Well, unfortunately, as we all know, the answer is not very well. So that black line, this is not my modelling, this is somebody else's modelling. The black line is business as usual global emissions, which are continuing to rise. This is just for the period to 2035. And then below that in blue, we have the pathway that countries have committed to with their existing Paris pledges. In green is the pathway that would be consistent with actually reaching a 2-degree warming target above pre-industrial levels. That still wouldn't reach a 1.5 degree target, so it's not as ambitious as we'd like to be. But the critical thing here is that gap between the blue and the green. We need to go much faster, and the longer it takes us to get down onto that green line, the more steep that reduction is going to have to be later. So to give you an idea again of the scale, we're talking about 11 billion tonnes more of mitigation per year between now and 2035. And we know that that requires much more than 2.4 trillion in clean investment. So that 2.4 trillion is only for the energy sector, and only if we don't keep investing in dirty technology, which of course we are. So just the scale of this problem requires different solutions than what we've done before. We've been thinking incrementally, and now we're beginning to shift to a very different way of thinking. So if we can have international transfers between New Zealand or, say, Germany and countries like Kenya or Chile or Colombia, then we might be able to go faster. And so modelling by some of my EDF colleagues has suggested that an efficient, a cost-effective way of reaching 2 degrees would involve on the order of 2 to 4 billion tonnes of transfers of CO2 equivalent every year. This is not the scale at which the Clean Development Mechanism was transferring units across countries. We need a different mechanism. We need to do this differently. It would allow, if we can get those transfers, we could achieve twice the mitigation, which would fill quite a bit of that gap at exactly the same cost. So it's not just about saving money. If we don't manage to do this effectively, I just don't think we're going to get there. So how do we do this? How do we create high integrity units and transfer them across countries? This is not an easy problem. So what do high integrity units involve? The first thing they involve is sensible accounting, so that when there's a reduction of emissions in one country and another country takes credit for that, there isn't also a third country who also takes credit for it, and a fourth country. This seems incredibly obvious, that when you trade, you don't sell the same good to many people, but we don't even have the rules for that yet. We need to have high ambition so that trading is not a way of avoiding action, it's a way of supplementing action and doing more. And for the developing countries who would be selling these units in these markets, it's not just a way of getting paid for things that you would have done anyway. It's about going further and deeper. We need to know that the actions we're taking are not just reducing emissions in the short term, but they're part of a long-term plan. They're actually leading us towards a commitment to long-term net zero. So they need to be embedded in structures that are much more long-term. It needs to be large-scale. The problem with small transfers, small projects and small efforts is that they're not transformational. They tend to be non-additional because of adverse selection problems. They often lead to leakage. So you might get a reduction here, but it pops up somewhere else. And also, relative to the reductions that you're getting, the transactions costs are very, very high. But small projects are terrifically attractive because they're not scary. So there is a continuous pullback to doing relatively small projects. And finally, it also needs a multi-year commitment. We're talking about we need to have changes that are not going to be reversed rapidly. So this is a long process. As anyone who's worked on domestic climate policy knows, this stuff doesn't happen fast. It's a process that grows and develops and evolves over time. That means you have to be committed to working together over long periods. And finally, as anyone who's done game theory knows, you can't get cooperation in a repeated game, which essentially is what this is, without knowing what other people have done. And one critical aspect of knowing what people have done in the past and whether they're cooperating, and you should respond by cooperating, is that you need to be able to observe their emissions with reasonable accuracy. So the approach that we're developing, we're calling climate teams, and we're working on building small groups of countries who work together to accelerate mitigation. So to be a concrete example, we are talking, I think today, with the Minister of Finance in Chile, and as a potential host country. As a country, not because this is our ultimate goal, is to deal just with Chile, but because we need to try it in a country where you have a reasonable chance of success and where we think we could implement it reasonably rapidly. So that Chile is the host, and then Chile needs to choose countries that they will work with. And so they can choose countries who are interested in buying units, so they're interested in paying for extra mitigation, but also they're countries who they have trade agreements with, where there's some cultural similarity, where there's existing trust. So they feel that they can work together as a team and really make a difference. And because you can't make everything purely contractual, these are relationships as well. So what is a climate team model? It works at a national scale. So on that axis is national level CO2 equivalent. And this is an aspirational standard. We don't expect that every country would be able to implement this immediately, but we're trying to show what it would look like if you did it really, really well as something that people can work towards. So there's the business as usual for a country. And we're talking about countries who have already made a nationally determined contribution. So they've already said what their target will be and that it's a reduction below business as usual. Countries have done this in different ways, but many countries have done this. They've set a target for 2030 emissions. You can't trade over a decade relative to a single year target. So the first thing you have to do is turn that into some sort of crediting baseline that creates a budget of emissions across the trading period. That reduction is autonomous by Chile. Chile has said they will do that themselves. And the countries who are going to be in the climate team could help with that. The advantage of being large scale and using this NDC is that the baseline is below business as usual, and it's far enough below business as usual that it's likely to be truly below business as usual, because of course business as usual is a prediction, it's a projection. No one really knows what business as usual is, and people have a tendency in this situation to be over-optimistic, or pessimistic, depending on your point of view. They think their growth is going to be higher, therefore they project higher emissions. So. And because it's based on an NDC, it's something that Chile is controlling. It's not being imposed on them from the outside. So then what happens is you've got this agreement at the beginning of the period, and then as the period plays out, you monitor the emissions, as Chile and many countries are already doing, using your national inventory. National inventories are not perfect, but they're using a consistent set of rules provided by the United Nations. There is a process for auditing them, and they can be continuously improved. And each time you do a national inventory, you can compare the emissions estimate in that to the crediting baseline, and the difference between those tells you how many units there are that can be credibly transferred. Because it's the national inventory, it's more credible than many measures. It's at the national scale, and because it's already being done, there's low transactions costs. You don't have to do a whole lot of new monitoring. And across the period, you end up with reductions that might be on this sort of scale. And for Chile, maybe if we're really optimistic, that's on the scale of 100 million tonnes of units, and that could be worth in the billions of dollars for Chile to support them in their transition and potentially find funding for the sort of social programs that are currently being demanded very strongly by their citizens. So what do we need to have to make this work? If Chile, if the host country, is going to really try hard to make transformational changes, they're going to have to be confident that they're going to get resources in return, that they're not going to do all this work and then have New Zealand say, oh, I'm really sorry, but we had a recession, we've had a change of government, we can't buy those units anymore. We're really apologetic, but we're ashamed that you've made all this investment. And this has happened before with the Clean Development Mechanism. We made all these promises, and then by the time the projects came through, nobody actually wanted to buy them. So we need to have this confidence because we want them to be doing radical changes. And when they've got that confidence and it's contractual, then they can go to the very large investors and give them more confidence that if they do those big investments, which are critical, then there will be a flow of funds and the government will be able to make that environment work for them. Because the investment is finally the critical thing. They also need some political support. It's always easier to do something if you can say that other people think it's a good idea, particularly if you're trying to do something radical. They may need help with capability if they're working with countries who've done similar efforts before, and they really need to know what their co-benefits are. And I know Ian will talk more about that after this. What do partners need? So the partners are countries like New Zealand, Canada, Switzerland. They are looking for internationally transferable units because we either have nationally determined contributions of our own that are very ambitious and that we are not going to be able to achieve domestically without extraordinarily high cost, or we would like to be able to make more ambitious commitments in the future, but we can't make those commitments unless we think that we can meet them through mitigation in other countries. So having these mechanisms will enable us to be more ambitious. But these units have to be credible. New Zealand, as an example, bought a lot of units under the Kyoto Protocol, and they all turned out, well, not all, many of them turned out to be nonsense and spurious units. And this was all over the newspapers in New Zealand. Citizens really didn't like it. They don't like spending their hard-earned money on something that isn't actually making a difference. And also, if we're going to work with Chile and put real effort into helping them do this, we have to have confidence that it's going to actually lead to them overachieving their NDC, so that there really will be something to transfer, because we're putting a lot of work in. In order to be sure that there's credible supply, the host has to show that not only can they meet their NDC, but it's actually possible technically and practically and not at outrageous cost to actually reduce much more. They could show this through policy capability. If they had, for example, an emissions trading system that was really effective, they could lower the cap in that emissions trading system, and that would almost automatically generate additional reductions beyond the NDC. But they also can show that they've got a pathway that's clearly mapped out and policies that are mapped out that are leading them on this transformational path. Or they might be able to show that there are some transformational projects that are so large on their own that if they were done, then Chile would definitely get beyond their NDC, and then all those other policies would simply allow them to reduce further still, and that would be effective. And in Chile, one of the attractions of Chile is that they have the opportunity to close coal plants, which would have a dramatic effect on their total emissions inventory. So a critical part of this agreement is that Chile constrains itself so it will only transfer to the partners in the agreement, or that it won't transfer without their agreement. Because the reason that we are working with Chile is in order to get those benefits. We don't want Chile to get halfway through the period and say, this is great, we've got these units, and now the Germans are offering us $200 a tonne for these, because suddenly they're panicking that they can't meet their agreements, and they say, oh, sorry, New Zealand, Germany's offered us a better deal. So they're committed to sell to us. All of us need to have credibility externally. We are doing this in the context of a terrible free rider problem. We are trying by our efforts to encourage other countries to cooperate, but our efforts will only be successful in doing that if people think we're doing something credible. So it's very important that other people are looking at what we're doing, they're critical of it, and they are confident that we are being genuine. We're not just trying to cheat the rules. And there's been plenty of that. So how does a climate team work? We've got these countries who are the partners, and once a climate team agreement has been signed, their incentives are aligned with Chile's. They want Chile to be successful. They want Chile to reach its NDC and be able to go beyond. So they will use their climate finance and their technical support more strategically because they really care now about the outcome. They don't just care about looking good, they actually want Chile to be successful. A second critical aspect is that not only will Chile be selling units, but they will be selling them at a price that actually makes it worthwhile. So we need a guaranteed minimum price. That means that for Chile, even if the whole Paris Agreement collapses or the price goes very low for some reason, that they will still get at least a minimum. But also, we need an option for New Zealand and Canada and Switzerland to be able to buy at a higher price, but not a completely outrageous price. And that's the thing that makes this financially attractive to us. And then one possible idea, and we're still working through what the options are here, is that you take that maximum price and you jointly work out how many units you think you might be able to transfer, and you multiply the two, and you put that amount of money into a trust fund of some sort, so that New Zealand and Switzerland can't back out of the deal. So it goes into, but that amount of money is really big. And I said before, this might be in the billions of dollars. New Zealand is really quite a small country. Switzerland's not that much bigger. New Zealand is unlikely, and the New Zealand government or the New Zealand Treasury is unlikely to be able to put hundreds of millions of dollars into a trust fund for something that might take years to come out. The Minister of Finance goes kind of pale when I suggest this to him. But we have an emissions trading system, and our companies know that they have future commitments, so they can do a deal with the government that they'll put the money into those sort of accounts in return for being able to access those units for their domestic compliance needs in future. Those go into a climate fund, and the payments only come out of that to Chile after it's been proven there are the additional reductions. And you've got the external observers on the outside making sure we're not, that we're behaving well and that this is genuinely leading to reductions. So there are a number of issues in design: environmental integrity, efficiency so that we can do this as well as we can. Equity is incredibly important, both within Chile, so it will be acceptable and robust and good, and also between the countries. And finally, endurance. This is not something that we want to just have work for a year or two. It has to be something that even as conditions change, we're able to adapt. Sorry, I'll skip over that one quickly. It is possible using this model to involve the private sector using domestic compliance instruments, but I'm conscious of time, so I'll skip over that. And that would allow firms to trade directly with each other. But New Zealand and Switzerland aren't going to want to depend only on an agreement with Chile, because Chile just might not be successful in reducing emissions. But you could have a whole network of these agreements. So New Zealand could also deal with Colombia, for example, and spread their risk, get a portfolio of options. And if you had a series of these agreements, you'd end up with something that looks a little bit like an international market, but isn't one fungible international market where any unit can be used anywhere. And the advantage of that is that if one of these agreements falls apart for political reasons or whatever, it doesn't bring the whole system down. It doesn't affect the other agreements. So there's some protection against the inevitable political fragility. Chile might actually end up being both a buyer and a seller in this, given their status. So finally, think large. We have to think on a really large scale because this is a large scale problem. That's very scary. It requires governments to be very brave in how they do this, both on the buyer and the seller side. But also think small. Think about small groups, not just multilateral agreements, but how can small groups of countries work together and really develop the trust that is required for these agreements to work. And I will stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susie, for this really great presentation. So we have some minutes for questions. So just raise your hand. Ah, you have that one. Okay, great. Tom.
That it's not on.
There we go. We've had a lot of conversations here in our conference about research and policy and action, and I don't know anybody in the profession who does a better job of illustrating that than this speaker. So thank you on several levels, Susie. There are a couple of questions that I want to toss your way without trying to tie up all the time here. One is, you talk about climate finance, but there's two streams of that. There's the Global Climate Fund, the more, concessional aid stream, and then there's the compliance-oriented ITMO stream. And there's been thought about how those two should tie together or not, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. The second is that you talk for very understandable reasons about there being a certain kind of contractual lock-in here between hosts and partners. Would it be possible to soften that a little bit by saying that, if Germany wanted to outbid, they could do so, but they'd have to pay some money back to the partners to compensate them for stranded costs? Maybe that would be too hard to keep track of. And third, you talk about elevated ambitions, but you didn't say anything about elevated ambitions in the partner countries. And part of the larger talk has been there are certainly plenty of developed countries that have NDCs that aren't so ambitious. And what would we want to try to do to get them to up their game as well in all this?
So very good questions. Thank you, Mike. So climate finance, I was thinking specifically of the climate finance that's given by governments that they're sort of obliged to do under the Paris Agreement. The big challenge is then how you link not only that, but these sorts of agreements to the private sector and how you mobilize them. Unfortunately, I'm not a finance person, but in my new job, I'm meeting a lot of billionaires, and I'm hoping that they're going to be able to help us work out how to shift those people's conversations, because it's not just the economic incentives, it's the way they think that matters. So in terms of being able to soften the agreement so that you might be able to sell to Germany, if Germany was able to offer the partners, say Switzerland, who might be a partner, a deal, Switzerland could sell their units to Germany. I think that's probably the easiest way to do that without the complexity. Yeah. And the third one about emission in our countries, in my country, yes, that is absolutely critical. I think it's critical for two reasons. One is that if a developing country looks at us and says, why are you buying units from us and not doing mitigation in your own country? That doesn't look credible. It doesn't look as though that we're really going to be committed to helping them, because we're not even committed to doing our own work. And so that's a real issue. But the second thing is that these sorts of agreements can enable us to make much deeper commitments. There is no reason why we have to stop at net zero. When we get to net zero, the world will still be warming and we're still living on it. And these agreements are the only thing we will have at that time to continue to make a contribution.
Thanks, Susie. I thought that was absolutely wonderful talk. It was very clear, particularly at the beginning. The climate club idea is inevitably, I mean, we have to, I think it's audacious and exciting. We've seen that the grand global cap and trade ideas have reached an impasse. So I think it's exciting. But we have to recognize, to be honest, that it's a difficult idea. I was wondering how it will interact with other ideas, because there are other groups who will start other things, like clubs of countries who agree to have a common carbon price. So just helping you.
This is not a silver bullet. This will not work for everybody. It is scary, but nobody I have seen has a solution that's not scary. So this is just a big, scary problem. In terms of, so climate clubs are not the same as this, because a climate club often is a club of buyers. And talking to the World Bank about this, they said those sorts of agreements are more at a governance level. They're not necessarily contractually binding. They may be setting similar rules about ambition, about monitoring, they're working together, etc. They would support something like this. If these countries are part of a climate club as well, then the team is a way of sort of operationalize that smaller idea. But there will be people who do something completely different again, and it's the sort of let many flowers bloom situation. We don't know what works, and we should be trying a whole range of things, but being critical and getting people like you to evaluate.
Okay, then we have 2 more questions here, so.
Yeah, thanks, Susie. It's a very interesting perspective. I'm just wondering, though, what this assumes is that there is a bunch of countries that are willing to spend money on mitigation anywhere in the world. With any partner they think will deliver mitigation. And I'm really wondering whether if you did have some countries that have this pot of money that they're willing to spend on, whether this would be the best use of that money. Because essentially it's going to be small. You're going to be dealing with a small group of countries whom you trust enough in order to be able to reach these long-term agreements. And that's inevitably going to constrain the ambition a great deal. And I'm just wondering, given the scale of the problem, wouldn't it be more efficient to take that money and spend it on research and development that would lower the cost of mitigation in the biggest emitters? Because if you did that, you might have a much, much bigger impact.
I think you should do that as well. Of course, it's going to be terrifically challenging to get people to put up the sort of money that is involved here. But I don't think they're going to put it up unless they're confident that it's going to be associated with real change. We've had all of these international funds that people put money into, and then there's processes for spending that money. And I think justifiably people are skeptical of that, and that limits the amount of money that will go in. And yeah.
I think you misunderstood.
Okay.
I was suggesting that the money be spent domestically on R&D, and that
Right.
R&D would lower the cost of emissions elsewhere.
Potentially, but let me take the example of New Zealand. We are spending a lot on R&D in cows. We're really good on cows. But it doesn't make sense for us to put our extra money into R&D into how India can reduce the energy, the fossil fuel nature of your energy grid. That work has to be done in India. It has to be responsive to Indian needs. It may benefit from work that's done in the US or Germany or China, but it's certainly not going to happen in New Zealand. So the location of the money and the location of the good researchers isn't necessarily going to match in that instance. And like I said to Thomas, I think we need to be doing a whole range of these sorts of things. And yeah, maybe we could talk more afterwards, but yeah.
So you mentioned that the climate teams might form partly on the basis of trade relationships, right? And that brings to mind the question of whether there'd be a role for shifting from purely production-based accounting to consumption-based accounting of carbon. And within those teams, if you could think about that relationship between trade and consumption and the carbon trading.
Yeah, so, and I think as Billy Pizer and others have pointed out, we shouldn't just be using one metric for success. Production emissions within your own country is quite limited. And we're in a country, Colombia, where produces a huge amount of coal and a lot of oil and gas, but it's nearly all exported. So that's not part of the story. We need to also be monitoring what's happening with consumption emissions, but also production of fossil fuel, because all of these different things have to be going down, and they're all part of a picture of where we need to be moving to. So yes, I've focused on the Paris-compliant production emissions, but yeah, I think we should be looking at both sides of that.
Okay, we are now running a bit late, so I would like to thank again Susie Kerr for this presentation and all this discussion. So please, thanks. With an applause. Okay, so now let's go to our second keynote speaker, who is the Principal Environmental Fiscal Policy Expert in the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department. He is specialized in fiscal analysis of climate change, environment, and energy issues. He was also part of the Resource for the Future, which many of you will know, and held the Alec Nis chair. You can follow also him and his posts in the climate change, carbon, and energy prices in the IMF blog, so which is quite interesting. So please join me to welcome Ian Perry.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. So I want to talk about the role of fiscal policy in climate change mitigation, and this is based on a couple of recent IMF reports. One is a paper we did for our board of directors this year, and another is one of our flagship publications, the Fiscal Monitor. So these papers are providing a toolkit for designing climate mitigation policies. We start by emphasizing that mitigation action is extremely urgent, even if all countries were to fully implement the So even if all countries were to fully implement the mitigation pledges they've made for the Paris Agreement in 2030, this would be cutting global emissions by only about a third of the emissions reductions that would be consistent with containing warming to 2 degrees Celsius, which of course is the upper bound temperature target of the Paris Agreement. So these reports are providing a framework for understanding issues in the choice of a mitigation instrument. We do emphasize the strong case for carbon pricing in terms of providing across-the-board incentives for cutting emissions, in terms of mobilizing a new and valuable source of new revenue, in terms for many countries of generating large domestic environmental co-benefits like reductions in air pollution deaths, and carbon taxation can be straightforward from an administrative perspective if it's building off existing fuel tax systems or royalty regimes for extractive industries. So we develop a quantitative framework which is now applied to 135 countries. That's because that's the data. We use data from the International Energy Agency on fuel use by sector, and that's available for 135 countries, not for small states, but and then this framework is quantifying the impacts of carbon pricing on emissions, on fiscal revenues, on economic welfare, accounting for domestic environmental benefits, and we're quantifying the trade-offs between carbon pricing and other mitigation instruments. And then we extend this analysis to the international level. Now, carbon pricing is not going to be for every country. Perhaps in a particular country, it's just politically very difficult. Perhaps in another country, energy prices are already on the high side relative to those in neighboring countries. Perhaps in another country, the authorities are concerned about promoting energy access and are reluctant to increase energy prices. So policymakers may be interested in alternative approaches which are less effective and less efficient than carbon pricing, but which might be more acceptable because they avoid a significant increase in energy prices. And traditionally, these approaches have taken the form of regulations, for example, for the energy efficiency of our products or for emission rates for power generators. And in principle, we could put together a package of regulations which could mimic many of the behavioral responses of carbon pricing. Not all of them. For example, we can't regulate that people drive less or conserve on the use of air conditioning. And also, regulations tend to be inflexible. They're not good about accommodating uncertainty over future technology costs or future fuel prices, and regulations are difficult to coordinate in a cost-effective manner across different sectors. So rather than regulations, if authorities are wanting to move forward but without a big increase in energy prices, we'd recommend the use of fee-bates. These provide a sliding scale of fees on products or activities with above-average emission rates and a sliding scale of rebates for products or activities with below-average emission rates. For example, if these are applied to the electricity sector, generators would be paying a charge in proportion to the difference between their CO2 per kilowatt hour and the industry-wide average CO2 per kilowatt hour multiplied by their output level. Now, fee-bates are not going to be feasible for everyone. Perhaps in capacity-constrained countries like India and Vietnam, something similar to a fee-bate could be achieved simply through raising their existing coal taxes and using the revenues to subsidize electricity consumption to contain the increase in energy prices. This figure shows projections of the change in fossil fuel CO2 emissions in a business-as-usual scenario with no new mitigation measures between 2017 and 2030. So the blue bars are the percentage increase in GDP, so almost 100% in China, over 130% in India. But the red bars are the percentage reduction in the energy intensity of GDP, which typically is about 20% over this period. So this is reflecting gradually improving energy efficiency, an assumption that the demand for electricity and energy products increases by less than in proportion to GDP, and the dampening effect on energy demand from gradually rising international energy prices. So the net result is that CO2 emissions, indicated by the black squares, increase by about 30% for the G20 countries as a whole. They collectively account for 80% of global emissions, but the increase is much more substantial, for example, in India at almost 80%. This table is illustrating the impacts on energy prices of introducing a comprehensive carbon price, illustrating the case of a $50 per ton carbon tax in 2030. So that's going to increase our coal prices by about 140%, although coal is largely an intermediate product rather than one that's consumed by households. Increases the price of natural gas on average about 45%. Increases the price of retail prices for electricity on average by about 32%. Increases the price of retail price of gasoline by about 9% on average. And in this figure, the black squares are the percentage reduction in fossil fuel CO2 emissions below business-as-usual levels in 2030 that would be consistent with meeting countries' mitigation pledges for the Paris Agreement. And the blue, red, and green bars are the emissions reductions from broad-based carbon pricing of $25, $50, and $75 per ton, respectively. So we can see that in some cases, a $25 per ton carbon tax is way more than sufficient to meet the mitigation pledge, for example, in China and South Africa. And in fact, in India and Russia, we're projecting that they're going to meet their emissions pledge in the business-as-usual case with no carbon pricing. But on the other hand, even a $70 per ton carbon price in 2030 is insufficient for some countries, such as Australia and Canada. And so there's this huge dispersion in the emissions prices that are implicit in countries' mitigation pledges, and this is reflecting not only differences in the stringency of commitments, as indicated by differences in the black squares across countries, but also differences in the price responsiveness of emissions, indicated by differences in the blue, red, and green bars. In particular, emissions tend to be a lot more responsive in countries that consume a lot of coal, like China, India, and South Africa. If countries were to phase in substantial carbon pricing by 2030, this would be mobilizing a valuable source of new revenue, typically between about 1% and 2% of GDP, for a $50 per ton carbon tax in 2030. In this figure, the red bars indicate the pure economic welfare costs of a $50 per ton carbon price in 2030. So that's just measuring the value of the foregone fossil fuel consumption to fuel users. So we're calculating trapezoids under fuel demand curves here. And these costs aren't that large, around 0.5% of GDP in emissions-intensive countries like China, India, and South Africa, and substantially less than that in other cases. But the yellow diamonds here are the domestic environmental co-benefits of carbon pricing, so reductions in air pollution deaths, reductions in traffic congestion and accident externalities, minus the pure economic welfare costs. And these net benefits are typically around zero or moderately positive in most cases, and substantially positive in the case of China, India, and Russia, where there would be very large local air pollution benefits from cutting back on the use of coal and oil. So we think that many countries can move ahead unilaterally with carbon pricing and up to a point make themselves better off before even accounting for the global climate benefit. So we think that the free rider problem has been somewhat overstated. This table is comparing the effectiveness of a range of mitigation instruments against that of a carbon tax in terms of their effectiveness at cutting emissions, where all policies are scaled such that they impose the same explicit or implicit price on CO2 emissions. So in the first column, we see that for some countries, just taxing coal alone is has effectiveness of about 80 to 95% of that of a broad carbon tax, for example, in China, India, Korea, Australia, and South Africa, because in these countries, the huge bulk of the emissions reduction under a carbon tax would come from reducing coal rather than reducing oil and natural gas. In the second column, we see that if countries were to implement an emissions trading system assumed to apply just to the power sector and to large industry, because this has typically been the practice to date, on average that has effectiveness of about 60% of that of a fully comprehensive carbon price. In the next column, we see that a tax on electricity output, which is quite common for countries to impose taxes on electricity output or consumption, that has relatively weak effectiveness, only on average 19% of that of a broad carbon tax, and that's because it's not promoting fuel switching in the power sector or reducing emissions outside of the power sector. Road fuel taxes are even less effective, only about 9% of that of a broad carbon pricing policy. That's because road fuel emissions account for a minor share of nationwide emissions, and carbon pricing only has a modest impact on increasing road fuel prices. But in the last two columns, we can see that if countries were to put together a package of measures, rebates or regulations that promoted fuel switching in the power sector and promoted improvements in energy efficiency across all sectors of the economy, and on average this has effectiveness of about 70% of that of a broad carbon pricing policy. At the international level, we recommend that policymakers consider the possibility of a carbon price floor arrangement as a complement to the Paris process. We think this is the best way to address concerns about competitiveness. It need only include a limited number of large emitting countries. In particular, if we were to impose a uniform carbon price across emissions in the G20 countries, who collectively account for about 80% of our global carbon emissions, then within the G20, more than 80% of the emissions reductions would be in 3 countries alone: China, India, and the United States. We think that this price floor could be designed equitably to provide a lower pricing requirement for emerging market economies like China and India, who have lower per capita income and contributed less to historical emissions than advanced countries, The price floor could be designed flexibly to accommodate carbon taxes at the national level, trading systems at the national level, or even other approaches like feebates and regulations if they achieve the equivalent emissions outcome as would have been achieved by meeting the price floor. And most important of all, we think this approach is strikingly effective. If we could just get advanced G20 countries to commit to either meeting their mitigation pledge or imposing a $50 per tonne carbon price, whichever's the more ambitious, in 2030, and we could get developing G20 countries like China and India to just do a carbon price of $25 per tonne, which doesn't seem very ambitious in my view, then that would still double emissions reductions in the G20 over and above the reductions that are implied by meeting current mitigation pledges. The key is to scale up ambition in China and India, where the huge bulk of the low-cost emission reduction opportunities are, and yet those two countries have relatively weak mitigation pledges. In fact, I think non-binding in the case of India. To operationalize a price floor agreement, we think that the focus needs to be on the effective carbon price, because that takes into account the possibility that direct carbon pricing schemes don't have complete coverage, and it takes into account pre-existing energy taxes, which may be increased or decreased at the same time as carbon pricing is phased in. But it doesn't make sense to equalize effective carbon prices across countries. These differ dramatically across countries, for example, depending on the share of road fuels in nationwide emissions and current excises on road fuels. Instead, we think that the agreement should focus on an agreed increase in the overall effective carbon price over time relative to that in a baseline level. And that allows countries a lot of flexibility in meeting this increase in the effective carbon price. They could increase fuel taxes, they could implement carbon pricing, leaving some sensitive sectors exempt. They could do regulations, for example, if that resulted in the same increase, the same emissions outcome as would have been met by meeting the target for the effective carbon price. This figure is illustrating the impact on different household income groups of carbon pricing, a $50 per tonne carbon price in 2050. So on average, in Canada, United States and China, this $50 per tonne carbon price for the average household would impose a burden of about 2.5% of their consumption, and in China, about 4% of their consumption. And carbon pricing can be anything from moderately regressive, as in the case of United States and China, to approximately distribution neutral, as in Canada, to moderately progressive, as in India, which reflects the disproportionately large consumption of electricity amongst wealthier households. And it's also noteworthy that the blue columns here are indicating the burden that results indirectly from the impact of higher energy prices on increasing the general level of prices. This is accounting typically for like 1/3 to 1/2 of the household burden. So just compensating households, for example, for higher electricity bills is going to fall well short of the full compensation that they would need. But a critical point is that these burdens on households are reduced quite considerably when the carbon pricing revenues are put back into the economy. For example, if we were to fully compensate the bottom 40% of households, which on average would take about 1/4 of the carbon pricing revenues, and we use the other 3/4 productively to fund productive investments for sustainable development goals, to fund general reductions in distortionary taxes, where this revenue recycling is benefiting households in general, then the net result of this package would be that the bottom 40% of households are better off overall, despite the increase in energy prices, and the burden on the top 60% of households is positive, but it's not that large, typically 1% to 2% of their consumption. And this figure's indicating estimates of the increase in production costs for industries that would result from a $50 per tonne carbon price in 2030. Averaged across all industries, the cost increase is pretty modest, at least in the case of Canada, India, and United States, as indicated by the blue bars, only about 1 to 2% increase in costs. But if we just focus on the 20% of most vulnerable industries, the cost increases are more pronounced, about 7% in India, about 10% in China. So this is indicating that competitiveness concerns are especially pronounced in the case of an emissions-intensive country like China, and it's underscoring that we probably need some transitory assistance for a limited number of industries, steel, aluminium, cement, and so on. And maybe we can discuss what form of instrument might be preferred. My own preference would be for output-based rebates, I think, rather than border tax adjustments. And just, it's important to think about how to enhance the political acceptability of carbon pricing. So we would recommend a comprehensive strategy that includes announcing the policy well ahead of time and phasing it in gradually so households and firms know this is coming and have time to adjust. We think it's important to have equitable, productive and transparent use of the carbon pricing revenues. We think it's important to have a comprehensive upfront package of assistance to help vulnerable households, vulnerable firms, vulnerable workers through retraining, relocation schemes, and vulnerable communities like coal-producing communities, maybe through grants for those communities. And it's very important, obviously, to have extensive consultations with stakeholders to try and get them on board and to have a extensive communications program to make sure the public are well aware of the benefits of the reform, for example, in terms of how they benefit from the use of the carbon pricing revenues. And more broadly, we'll need to complement this policy package with supporting measures, perhaps an upfront commitment to renewables to help enhance the credibility of carbon pricing. We'll probably need some upgrades to the power grid to extend it to renewable generation sites. In some countries, we may need to simplify land acquisition procedures to make it easier for investors to acquire sites for renewable generation. In some countries, we may need to liberalize energy markets to increase the effectiveness of our carbon pricing. And then progressively over time, we want to be extending carbon pricing to other emissions sources such as cement, fluorinated gases, forestry, methane leaks from extractive industries, and so on. And then my final slide, just on some what I think is useful research needs from our own perspective based on the work that we do. I think more country-level work on the prices that would be needed in a first best approach to implement countries' mitigation pledges would be very helpful, help refine our own estimates of these. In addition, given that there's going to be political constraints on carbon pricing in most cases, we need to be thinking about what's the next best or third best combination of policy instruments. How would we design that if there are constraints on carbon pricing? We hear all the time that the incidence analysis is extremely valuable, particularly how authorities can redistribute the burden across households through a use of the carbon pricing revenues. And I think more information on the design specifics for complementary measures like technology policy is very useful. If a country is moving ahead with fiscal incentives to promote renewables or electric vehicles, exactly what level incentive should they be providing? How should they phase it out over time? Should the incentive be discretionary, responding to future changes in the costs of the technology, or should it follow a fixed rule? That sort of practical guidance, I think, would be very helpful for many countries that have these sorts of policies in place. And then thinking about practical guidelines for pricing other emissions sources. For example, a tax subsidy scheme for the forestry sector may well be feasible if property rights are well defined at the border between forestry and agriculture. But if that's not the case, what sorts of indirect pricing schemes might be appropriate? Maybe we can impose a tax on agricultural activities that are leading to forest clearance. And then finally, just at the international level, I think more work would be useful on the sorts of coalitions of major emitting countries and the price schedules within those coalitions. So my own view is that we should have differentiated prices, lower prices to try and entice India and China in. But what sorts of configurations of these coalitions would be consistent with warming goals? And then just thinking about how to develop procedures, practical procedures for monitoring effective carbon pricing that could underpin this sort of international agreement on carbon prices. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much, Ian, for this presentation. And well, we have several minutes for questions. So we have, 1 and 2 here. And just raise your hand so I know and can pass the microphone.
Thanks, Ian. Another great example of research taken to policy, so much obliged. Very good. I hope we get to see the slides, if you don't mind sharing a PDF of them with the organizers. That would be terrific. I have 3 short questions. One, very interesting, the findings about India and Russia. I think in less polite context, we sometimes refer to this as NDCs that are full of hot air, and they're certainly not the only 2 countries. This is an issue, I think, for Susie's clubs as well, or teams, and I don't know what we're supposed to do about it. So that's one point. Second, I don't agree with you about the free rider problem being overstated, simply because if the countries that are supposed to get these very large pollution benefits, they're not dumb. They know this is true, and forever they haven't been willing to do it. So I know that in some cases you could combine the fiscal benefits of reducing tax evasion with the air quality benefits, but I think there's still a big free riding problem. And finally, the point you make about the various steps that are needed to implement policies effectively, there are a lot of countries in the developing world where you wouldn't be able to count on some of the assumed conditions, like the ability to ensure proper use of the revenues or the possibility of transparency. Have you thought at all about how that would change the kind of recommendations that would be put forward here? Could that make kind of non-robust the arguments for a carbon tax?
Maybe I better just answer those before I forget the question. So the first one was about countries like India that have hot air. Well, I just think we need to engage in a transparent dialogue, particularly with India, given that it's such an incredibly important player, and have dialogue with them about, well, how can we help you scale up your ambition? I mean, they do have a modest coal tax in place, but it is very difficult for them to increase energy prices. So maybe they can increase their coal tax some and use the revenues to hold down electricity prices. So promote fuel switching, but not a reduction in electricity demand, which is not bad. It's not fully efficient. But I think we need a dialogue with India to discuss, well, how can we get you to, for example, increase the ambition in your mitigation pledge? Now it's transparent that you're not actually going to do anything in the baseline. China has pledged to reduce emissions intensity by 2/3, and their constraint is actually binding, whereas India's pledged to reduce emissions intensity by 1/3, and their constraint is not binding. So what does it take for to bring India into a more ambitious agreement? Maybe, ideally, in my view, they'd be in a carbon pricing arrangement where they'd have a weaker price floor requirement than advanced countries, and they'd have the flexibility to meet that in a way that's consistent with their domestic agenda. So it's probably unrealistic they would implement an economy-wide carbon price, but maybe they could replicate it through some increase in their coal tax and other measures. What sorts of incentives does India need to entice them into that? Maybe they need some technical assistance, maybe they need some external support. So I think that's an important dialogue. The second question was, sorry, what was it? Yeah, the free. No, I mean, fair enough. I mean, these air pollution benefits may not be that transparent, but I think there is. You know, I was in India recently, and fortunately was able to leave New Delhi just before this huge smog appeared. So I think people are aware of the air pollution problem. You know, you go to Vietnam, a lot of people are wearing masks. You know, China, Vietnam, India realize this is a very serious problem and they need to do something about it. And making progress on the climate commitment does have some co-benefits. So, I mean, I appreciate that, you know, the fact is we haven't had major mitigation at the global level, and it's primarily driven by this free rider problem. But I think pointing out to countries and quantifying the reductions in air pollution just maybe makes it a little bit easier for them to make progress. And then the third point was on these comprehensive strategies. How realistic is it, for example, to expect that you can compensate low-income households for higher energy prices? Well, I think fairly realistic in advanced countries that have well-established social safety nets, but in other countries that don't have social safety nets, it's not realistic. So we have to think of second-best measures. Maybe there's some targeted jobs program. Maybe there's some clean fuel that is